All righty. Good morning, everybody. Come on in, get settled. We're going to open with a word of prayer and get started this morning. All right, John's ready to pray. All right, thanks, Lord, for this day. We thank you for the opportunity again to continue in the book of Romans and just pray your blessing as we work through some interesting and sometimes divisive issues and topics for the church back then and also for the church today. We ask that you would just guide us in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we're starting chapter 14, and probably we're just a couple of weeks from really finishing the book of Romans. It's been kind of a long haul. We're going to kind of just do a background today to the situation that's going on in chapter 14 and part of 15 today. So it's kind of a reconstruction. I'm wanting you to kind of feel like you're sitting in the little house church and Phoebe, who carried the letter of Romans for Paul, is reading it to you. And you're one of maybe two groups in the church that Paul's going to refer to here in this passage. You're either part of the weak or you're part of the strong. So I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of background to that, and then next week we're going to talk a little bit more about the application of that, the relevance of that. It has a lot to say really to the church today, in general, to our church, because we all feel a lot of tensions and disunity over issues like masks and politics and vaccines. And Paul actually, he addresses those issues, not specifically, but he does address the issue of what is to be our attitude towards each other when we differ on areas, gray areas. So it's an important passage. So it'll be a two-parter, and then probably we're going to be finished because the last part of Romans 15 and then 16 we covered as an introduction to the book of Romans. So I mentioned I have a book called Reading Romans Backwards. And so we started that way. We started at the end of Romans to kind of see the context for the rest of the letter. So we start with the topic of Paul as pastor, and the word pastor means shepherd. And Paul is very concerned about the unity of the church in Rome, the unity between two differing groups within the church. And so he kind of waits till the last part of Romans to address this. And part of the reason for that is that Paul didn't start this church. You know, he wasn't the foundation to this church, just like is very different from 1 Corinthians, you know, where Paul can say, well, I'm your spiritual father and you're my kids, you know, and I can talk to you a certain way. And Paul can't do that with the church at Rome because it was established by other people. And so, you know, in chapter 15, he actually says, you know, that I've addressed you quite boldly on certain things. And that's because he just doesn't have that same kind of fatherly authority to deal with these issues. So he has to be very careful in the way that he addresses. But, you know, even though Paul's he's a missionary, he's a theologian, he's an apologist, or defends his own gospel, Paul also is very much at heart a pastor. He's very much concerned about the unity of the church at Rome. And so he's prepared for this discussion in the sections that we just covered in chapter 12 and 13. He re-emphasizes the idea of loving one another 5 times there. And then at the end of chapter 13, he closes with this plea to not have dissension or quarrels would be the word, and to not have jealousy. And this kind of sets up for chapter 14 and the first part of chapter 15. And so at the end of that first paragraph, it said he makes it a point to focus on the believer's attitudes towards others versus their individual preferences and convictions. Okay, that's an important thing to kind of keep in mind here. And I do say there that he's careful not to show partiality to one side or the other. That is true, although Paul's going to clearly side with one group over the other. But I can explain, how that works, probably more so next week. So in order to understand kind of what's going on here, there's a lot of background kind of historical situations that we kind of need to understand in order to put ourselves in the place of the original readers there. And, all the way through Romans, in various sections, Paul's addressed the issue of the relationship between the Jew and the Gentile. So particularly in chapters 1 through 4, he's talked about that. And we went through chapters 9 through 11, where he talks about Jews and Gentiles there. But, in those conversations, it was mostly about explaining his gospel. What's my gospel is the phrase that he uses. And he wants them to understand what his gospel is because, this letter is an appeal letter. It's a letter, as we've talked about, where he's saying, okay, guys, I want you Romans to understand where I'm coming from, and I'm going over to Spain, and I want to use Rome as a base for mission to Spain, and then I want you guys to help me with that financially, and I want some co-workers from the church there to help me with this. So his focus in those earlier sections between Jew and Gentile wasn't so much on the issue of the disunity within the church itself. But now he draws the circle tighter with a series of impassioned pleas directed at those who make up the 5 or 6 small house churches in Rome. Chapter 16, if you read the greetings there, there are at least 5, probably 6 house churches that are mentioned in the greetings section there. What is the nature of the divisions in the church? Why is this issue so obviously important to the apostle? Reconstructing a plausible background to the situation is possible by reviewing similar controversies in other Pauline letters and New Testament books, as well as evidence from contemporary Jewish and Roman sources. So Paul writes Romans somewhere around 56, 57 AD. 56 be the winter. And a couple of years earlier, he wrote a series of letters to the Corinthians. And in 1 Corinthians 8 through 10, 3 whole chapters, Paul spends on this issue that we're talking about here, okay, of division in the church over issues of eating meat and, tradition and so on. So what Paul's talking about here in chapter 14 and 15 is kind of a summary of some of the principles that he's already worked out in the 1 Corinthian letter. And next week we're going to kind of tie those two together. So one thing I've mentioned before is kind of the historical situation is Paul's writing during the reign of Claudius. Well, actually, he's writing after Claudius is dead a couple of years earlier, and Nero, who's quite young at this point. I think he's like 17 when he becomes emperor. And so understanding what has happened in the church and what has happened within the city of Rome, the Jewish population in the city of Rome at this time is the 3rd largest in the empire, okay? So first to be Jerusalem, second will be Alexandria in Egypt. And there's some good estimates of the population of Rome at this time, probably somewhere between 400 and 500,000 people living in the city. Almost a third of those will be slaves, right? Somewhere between 40 and 50,000 people in Rome will be Jewish. So that's a pretty large population of Jews, right? And so if you're talking 400,000 in the whole city and 40,000 are Jews, you're talking about a tenth of the city. Where are the Jews going to live? Are they going to be scattered around all over the city? No, they're going to probably try to live together, right, in ghettos or quarters of the city. They're going to want to live pretty close to the place that they worship, right? The synagogue. Why would that be? Do they have to walk? And what's the problem with walking on the Sabbath? Okay, you can only go somewhere like 0.6 of a mile, right, on the Sabbath. And so, you want to kind of be close to your place of worship. And so we know there were probably at least 5 or 6 different synagogues in the city of Rome at this time. And so, you have Messianic Jews who are still attending their synagogues. We see that in James chapter 1, where James is writing to the 12 tribes of the dispersion. In chapter 2, he talks about how when you meet together in your synagogue, which a lot of translations unfortunately translate as your meeting place. It's not a meeting place, it's a synagogue where they're meeting Jewish Christians. And also probably meeting separately with other believers outside of the synagogue. So we're at kind of a formative time when, Sabbath, of course, is Friday night through Saturday evening. But then the believers were probably also meeting on Sunday because it became the Lord's Day, right? And so you have them meeting twice. And so the earliest church in Rome, we're talking mainly about Jews who become believers in Jesus as Messiah. You have Gentiles who have become Jewish, basically. They're called proselytes. Then you have God-fearers who are Gentiles who they embrace Judaism, but they don't get circumcised like the proselytes. They just don't want to go that far. I can understand that. So here you have this makeup of the church. The basis of the church is mainly a Jewish church. And this probably gets its start from Pentecost. If you read in the book of Acts in chapter 2, all these Jews come from all over the world, right, for the pilgrim festival of Passover, and then they stay for Pentecost 50 days later. And Luke tells us that there are Jews from Rome. They're proselytes from Rome. They're God-fearers from Rome who have come there. They hear Peter's sermon, and they go back to their hometown. And they start these little communities, these little house churches in the city of Rome. Now, Jesus himself had warned in the Gospel of John that there would come a time when you're going to get kicked out of your own synagogue, your own place of worship. John 16, 2 and 3 you can read, but there are actually 3 references in the Gospel of John where Jesus says, look, be prepared for this. Eventually a time's coming when you won't be able to worship among your own people because you believe Jesus is the Messiah. And so, there's these tensions that are going on within this community at Rome. And I talked a couple of weeks ago about, there are other tensions going on between Jews and Gentiles at that time period. There are riots, there are, tax revolts, the emperor has to write a letter about the Jews, in Alexandria. And so what seems to have happened in Rome is that within the little tight-knit Jewish community, there have been dissensions, there have been arguments, there have been this internecine, scramble between Jews who believe in Jesus as Messiah and Jews who don't believe in Jesus as Messiah. It's happening within the synagogues themselves. Later at the end of the first century, the synagogue will actually introduce a blessing, a barakot, in which you're supposed to curse the Nazarenes. Okay? Doesn't make you feel too welcome in your worship place, right? So they're starting to push the Jewish Christians out of the synagogue. And it comes to such a point that it comes to the emperor's notice, Emperor Claudius. And in 49 AD, Claudius basically just says, get out of here. Get out of Rome. I don't want you guys here anymore. And we have evidence of that from at least 2 Roman historians, which I put on your sheet. Because the Jews at Rome caused continuous disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, it's kind of a garbled form of Christ, right? They're arguing over Christ. They're debating about Jesus, the Messiah, right? Just like Paul did when he was, traveling in the book of Acts, and he goes into a synagogue and he starts reading from Isaiah and the scriptures and says, let me tell you about this Messiah. And then what do? Well, they kick him out, usually, or you kick him out of town, or in one town they stoned him. Dio Cassius, he says, as the Jews had again increased in numbers, but could hardly be banished from the city without a tumult because of their multitude, he did not actually expel them, he's talking about Claudius, but forbade them to meet in accordance with their ancestral customs. Okay? Well, it's pretty hard to enforce kicking every Jew out of Rome, but if you say, look, you can no longer meet in your synagogues, well, that's going to cause a lot of them to get out of town. And we see an example of that in the book of Acts. After this, Paul left Athens, went to Corinth. There he found a Jew named Aquila who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Okay, so Priscilla and Aquila, just a perfect example of, what I was talking about, a Jewish Christian couple who had been meeting, in their own synagogues and probably worshiping in a small community of Messianic Jews as well. They're forced out of Rome, and they run into Paul in Corinth, and they do ministry together, right? And it's interesting because when you go to chapter 16 of Romans, Paul greets them because now where are they? They're back in Rome. And what are they doing? Paul mentions they have a house church in their own home, and they're believers meeting together. So what are the effects of this on the church at Rome, the earliest kind of community there? So obviously, if the church at Rome was originally kind of dominated by Jewish Christians, right, in the leadership and so on, and then all of a sudden they're gone, and now you have the mission of Paul going out to the Gentiles, and then more Gentiles start to enter the church. The leadership of the church and the demographics of the church at Rome start to change from Jewish to Gentile. And then what happens is 5 years later, Claudius dies, and his edict kind of dies with him, or it's left unenforced. And what starts to happen? These Jews who left Rome start to come back to their hometown. They start to come back and start the synagogues up again. They start to come back to the early Christian communities, right, which have been controlled for 5 years by Gentiles. Going to have some tension? Yeah, definitely going to have some tension. Gentile believers who by and large do not share the Jewish believers' deeply ingrained traditions of Torah observance with its many facets. We can see this even in Paul's lengthy greetings to those in the Roman church in chapter 16. So Paul mentions about 27 people there in Romans 16, and you can tell by the types of names there what ethnicity they are typically, right? So out of those 27, there are 5 or 6 names that are Jewish. So predominantly we're talking about Gentiles that he's greeting there. So when 5 years later Claudius dies, his edict is rescinded, left unenforced. The Jewish Christians start to return to their churches. Hey, we set this up. Which sets the stage for the quarreling and jealousy that Paul anticipates in the previous chapter. Now, he's obviously been told this by all of the people that he knows, who he's been working with, that there are definitely some issues there. But the interesting thing is when we read this chapter, 14 and part of 15, is he never actually says Jew or Gentile. Okay, he never frames it that way, and for important reasons. When you have a divisive issue in the church, there's a spectrum, right, of people. It's not like black and white. It's not like polarized completely from one to the other. And so what Paul is addressing here when he uses these words, there's the strong and there's the weak, right? And amongst the strong probably are going to be primarily Gentiles that he's referring to. And amongst the weak, you're going to have primarily Jews, but you're going to also have a mixture. You're going to have Jews who have kind of enlightened idea of Torah observance, right? Like Paul. Paul says, hey, to the Jew I became like a Jew, to the Gentile I become like a Gentile. I can work with both groups, no problem. You probably have Gentiles who were God-fearers or who were proselytes who had embraced Judaism and then embraced Jesus as Messiah, who, had been following Jewish traditions. And so they're more here. And there's probably a bunch of people in the middle here, right? It's a spectrum there. And so people in the church are falling along the lines of this spectrum. And so as you read through the chapter, you can kind of see, well, okay, what are the issues? What specifically is he talking about? And so I tried to do a little bit of a chart there. Eating meat versus eating only vegetables, right? So there's some in the church who don't want to partake of any kind of meat. They'll only eat vegetables. You have some in the church who don't have a problem drinking wine. You have others who say, no, I don't want to drink wine, okay? So think about that. You're coming together as a church. You're celebrating what? Communion. And you're supposed to pass around this common cup of wine, right? So you think about the kind of practical ramifications of what's happening here. On the other side, you have those who want to honor the Sabbath, perhaps over other days, right? Like that's our traditional day of worship. We think this day is most important. And you have other people on the spectrum who say, well, yeah, but the Lord's Day is Sunday, all right? Do we have that issue today in churches? Yeah, still going on, isn't it? And probably Paul keeps it pretty generic here when he talks about days, so probably also could refer to celebration of special days like feast days. Jews tended to have fasting days, very ritualistic, very traditional, Monday and Thursday. Those were fast days in the Jewish tradition. Okay, New Moon, Passover. Even Paul, when you read Acts 20, why is he going to Jerusalem? He's going to Jerusalem for the Passover, right? He's still celebrating some of the Jewish festivals. He doesn't have a problem with that. Now, in a general sense there, what Paul is going to be talking about here are issues that distinguish between what is called clean or kosher, right? We're familiar with that word. In the Greek, it's the word katharos, which means pure or clean. Jesus in the Gospels in Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the what? Pure in heart is the same word that's used there in Matthew. So we distinguish between what's clean and kosher and what is common or unclean, and the word is koinos, all right? It's kind of where we get the word koinonia, what's common to everyone. Now, why is there a problem? Well, there's a problem because if you're Jewish, you can only eat meat that has been properly prepared, right? You can only eat meat that has gone through a very strict ritual of preparation. And so when you go to the marketplace in a town like Rome or Corinth or whatever, and you want to buy some meat, you have no idea of the history of that piece of meat. You don't know who butchered it. You don't know how they butchered it. When I lived in England, when I was doing my degree, some friends of ours who were also graduate students lived in the town next to us called Heaton Park. And it was a big Jewish community there. And they rented a little apartment right above a Jewish butcher. So imagine the smells, a Jewish butcher. And if you ever read, what kind of things you have to go through in order to prepare a chicken or prepare a piece of meat, right? A Jewish butcher cannot use a serrated knife. Okay? Why? Because that might tear the skin or it might tear the animal. You're not allowed to eat anything that's torn in Jewish tradition, right? You have to drain the blood a certain way. Matter of fact, you don't have to just drain the blood. You have to make sure that there isn't any significant amount of blood anywhere in the blood vessels. You have to cut them out, right? The rabbi said, look, if you eat an olive's worth of blood, you're unclean. How do you measure that? Let's get an olive and, cut it out. An olive's worth of blood. And so all of these issues, that the church is dealing with, because these are traditions that have grown up, that Jews and Jewish Christians have grown up with. A lot of meat in that time would be dedicated to some of the idols in the town, right? So if you went to the Temple of Diana or whatever, they're not just places of worship, they're restaurants. They're places of community gathering. People are going there to eat lunch. What are they serving? Oh yeah, we offered this to Diana yesterday, it's pretty fresh. And so there's this whole issue of, I can't eat this stuff because it's been offered to an idol. And so we're not just talking about Jews there, like in 1 Corinthians 8 through 10. Paul's talking also about pagans who have come out of this history, this practice of offering meat to idols. So it has become a big issue. I put a little quote there at the bottom from the Mishnah, which is the Jewish writings. Libation wine in any quantity whatsoever is forbidden and renders other wine forbidden. Okay. Now, if you read that section of the Mishnah, there's like 3 pages on what makes wine kosher or not. I mean, they go into the most astounding detail of whether the wine is kosher or not. Because in Greco-Roman culture, wine would be poured out as an offering, or it's called a libation. That's what that word means, right? So almost every house is designed in that time period to have a little altar in the corner of the kitchen or whatever, and you have your little statues of your little gods and goddesses, and you have a little bowl, and you get your wine and you pour it out. It's like your morning ritual, right? It's like you're doing your devotions. They even in the tombs, I've seen a picture of this, where they have the tomb and it's all covered, and then they have a little hole that they drill in the top of the tomb, and there's a little tube that comes up to the top. And it's so you can pour out wine to your dead ancestors. Okay? So these are the traditions in the culture that, the Jews and Gentile Christians here are living in. And they're struggling. They're not sure, can I do this? Can I not do this? Should I eat this? Should I not eat this? And so this is where Paul is addressing this. Moving to the back then. So to understand why this has become such an issue, we have to go back. We have to understand the tradition. So in the period before the Babylonian exile, right, most Jews did not really follow the Israelite law or Jewish traditions very faithfully. Okay? They did not worship one God very faithfully, right? They didn't really care as much about Sabbath. They didn't follow all the food laws. And as a matter of fact, the food laws and some of the ritual laws, they're really mostly for priests. They weren't for people in general. But what happens after the exile is that the community is scattered all over, and they start to appreciate their traditions and the laws. And they start to, okay, yeah, we learned our lesson about idolatry. Okay, we're going to be strictly monotheistic from now on. They start to be very careful about the Sabbath, right? They start to make sure that they're eating the proper foods and preparing the foods in the right way. They're making sure not to interact with Gentiles too much. They're not supposed to marry a Gentile, right? And so all of these things, by the period of the first century, by the period of Jesus, it's a very strict tradition, very strict community. And that's going to set them into this collision course with the surrounding cultures, right? Because what happens in the period right before Jesus, a couple centuries, is you have a movement called Hellenism. You have a movement that says, well, we love everything Greek. Greek is great, and Greek language and Greek art and Greek, gymnasiums and everything, and so we want to make you all like the Greeks. And so you have the generals who took control of Palestine after Alexander the Great. They go in and they go, well, there's one guy in particular named Antiochus Epiphanes who basically comes into Palestine and says, okay, we're going to burn all your Torahs. You can't worship in the temple anymore. All your traditions, just forget about it. We're going to turn you into Greeks. How do you think that goes over? Right? Not so good. So this is where you get these freedom fighters, and the Maccabees come in and they fight. So there's like 4 books of the Maccabees. They're histories of the period before Jesus where all this stuff is happening. And I just put one quote there, a couple of quotes actually. Eleazar is this very old man who just rebels, and his whole family rebels against this pressure to become Greek. And Antiochus, he's speaking to Antiochus Epiphanes, so this is the Greek ruler of the time. He says, therefore we do not eat defiling food, for since we believe that the law was established by God, we know that in the nature of things, the creator of the world, in giving us the law, has shown sympathy towards us. He has permitted us to eat what will be most suitable for our lives, but he has forbidden us to eat meats that would be contrary to this. It would be tyrannical for you to compel us not only to transgress the law, but also to eat in such a way that you may deride us for eating defiling foods which are most hateful to us. How far do they want to go in this? First Maccabees, many in Israel stood firm, were resolved in their heart not to eat unclean food. They chose to die rather than to be defiled by food or to profane the holy covenant, and they did die. I mean, how many of you have family members or friends who are like vegetarians or vegans? Are they prepared to die for that? I mean, some will go a long way, right? In one way, it's a very similar situation. We have family members in our family who are vegetarian, vegan, and my wife has to keep a list on her phone of, okay, we're inviting them over. Let's see, what can we make? Right? How many of you ever been in that situation, right? Or sometimes, when you first get to know someone and then they come over and you've made this big meal and you serve it to them and you put it out and they go, well, I'm sorry, I can't eat that, right? It's kind of tricky. And now ramp that up, to what's happening here. So Gentiles are kind of looking at this, right? In their communities, they see how the Jews, they don't want to eat with them. They don't, eat their food. And so I put a couple of responses there from non-Jews about this. The Jews have made their hatred of humankind into a tradition, and on this account it introduced utterly outlandish laws not to break bread with any other race or to show them any goodwill at all. Okay, break bread means to eat together, right? Another writer says, the Jews are a race that has made its own life apart and irreconcilable. They cannot share with the rest of humankind in the pleasures of the table. Okay? Table fellowship is such an important thing in that ancient culture. It means I accept you. It means I agree with you in many ways, and I'm willing to fellowship with you around this common table. So even then, when we get to the period of Jesus, this is all kind of gelled together. Now, when the Pharisees gathered around Jesus, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. And then Mark has this little parentheses where he's explaining for his Gentile readers. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they are thoroughly washed their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders, and they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are many other traditions they observe, the washing of cups, pots, so on. You have to have separate dishes for cooking, separate dishes for serving, separate dishes for Gentiles or Jews. Okay? If they get dirty, if you have a Gentile that you're eating with, you cannot mix the dishes together in the sink. We have someone in class They're in Hawaii actually, but I emailed them, Malad and Ron Moss, and she grew up in Iran in a Muslim family. So I'd emailed her and said, listen, I want to talk to you a little bit about your upbringing and how that worked and stuff. And she actually calls me from Kauai yesterday. So we had a good conversation about it. And she said, my family wasn't, super strict. But if you did have a non-Muslim over, when you washed the dishes, you had to separate them in the sink and wash them differently, because you can't have the water that's going into the clean dishes going into the non-kosher dishes, or they use the word halal and harem. Halal means kosher, harem means no, can't do it. And she talked about her brother. Her brother was not really practicing. And in Islam, of course, you can't eat pork, just like in Judaism, but you also cannot drink any alcohol, period. Okay? But her brother sometimes would have friends over and they'd have a beer, and so they'd have to separate all these dishes out and so on. And in Islam, if you do eat pork or you do drink alcohol, it's 40 days that you're unclean. Okay? I mean, that like ramps it up from the Old Testament a lot. So I want to show a little clip. When we did the Gospels years ago, I always show this clip because it's a good reminder of this tradition.
And how do we keep our balance? That I can tell you in one word. Tradition!
Tradition! Tradition! Tradition! Tradition! Tradition! Tradition!
Because of our traditions, we've kept our balance for many, many years. Here in Anatevka, we have traditions for everything. How to sleep, how to eat, how to work, how to wear clothes. For instance, we always keep our heads covered and always wear a little prayer shawl. This shows our constant devotion to God. You may ask, how did this tradition get started? I'll tell you. I don't know. But it's a tradition. And because of our traditions, every one of us knows who he is and what God expects him to do.
Who day and night must scramble for a living, feed the wife and children, sing his daily prayers, and who has the right, as master of the house, to have the final word at home? The Papa! The Papa! Tradition! The Papa! The Papa! Tradition! Who must know the way to make a proper home? A quiet home, a kosher home. Who must raise a family and run the home? So Papa's free to read the holy book.
Yeah, that's good. The mama, sorry, I left the mama out. The mamas and the papas. But you can see there, make sure you're doing the bread the right way, you got the fish the right way, you're doing the meat the right way. Now, the only difference is when Tevye says, where did we get these traditions? He says what? I don't know. Well, that's not true. Nobody in this time period would say, I don't know. They'd say, we got it from the Bible, right? We got it from the Torah, and this is why we're following it. And so it's not just an arbitrary thing here, and this is why it creates such a tension there. So that leads us to the last section there, the issue of Torah observance in the early church. So as I mentioned earlier, all the first followers of Jesus, the leaders of the church, were Jewish. And when you read through the book of Acts, Luke's very careful when you go through Acts. He wants to describe that these Jewish Christians are not, it's not a new sect, it's not a break off of Judaism, is that they're the real fulfillment of the prophetic hope of the Old Testament. And so Luke will say, they still went to the temple. They went to the synagogue on the Sabbath. They circumcised their children. They ate kosher foods. They tried to avoid ritual impurity. So when the good news of the gospel began to find success among the Gentiles, this created both a wonderful opportunity and a thorny dilemma for the earliest church. To what degree do we expect Gentiles to follow Jewish practices? How can both groups worship the same Lord together in unity? Most importantly, can Jews and Gentiles sit at the same table and share the same food in table fellowship? It's so interesting how we have these similar issues, right? Where people are kind of struggling even in this class. Should I sit at a table with other people, right? Should I sit in the back by myself? We weren't allowed to have food here for a year and a half, right? We weren't allowed to share in meals together here. So I really want you to think about what Paul's saying here, and we're going to unpack this quite a bit more next week. There's a little quote there from the book of Acts. James, the leader of the Jerusalem church, who's the brother of Jesus, he says, "You see, brother Paul," and this is kind of right before Paul's going to get arrested, "how many thousands of believers there are among the Jews, and they're all zealous for Torah." They're Jewish Christians, and they're all zealous for Torah, right? So then, you have this series of examples in Acts. You have Peter and Cornelius, a story of Peter and Cornelius, which in some ways kind of mirrors an earlier story in the book of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel is prophesying that Israel is going to go into captivity. The Jews are going to be scattered amongst the nations and the pagans. Their traditions are going to be, it's going to be much more difficult to live and keep your traditions. So the Lord said, "Thus shall the people of Israel eat their bread unclean among the nations to which I shall drive them." What God had just said to Ezekiel, because he wants Ezekiel to do like a little, an example, just kind of show the Israelites what they're going to have to do. He tells Ezekiel, "I want you to bake your bread on human dung." Ezekiel's going, "What? No, I can't do that. I'm a priest, right? I don't want to do that." And God says, "Yeah, but I want you to show what it's going to be like when Jews have to start living out among Gentiles. They're going to daily become in contact with issues that could make them ritually unclean." And so what does Ezekiel say? "Then I said, Lord God, I have never defiled myself from my youth up until now. I have never eaten what died of itself or was torn." Okay. In Judaism today, there's a word called tref, which means it's Yiddish for torn. And it became kind of a general word for not kosher. Because if an animal's torn, or you can't eat, roadkill or anything like that. You always have to know exactly where everything came from. "I have never eaten what died of itself or is torn by animals, nor has carrion flesh," right, something that's died out in the wilderness, "come into my mouth." Then you have this parallel story in the book of Acts of Peter, kosher Peter, which is funny, I think. Peter became hungry, wanted something to eat, and while it was being prepared, he fell into a trance. Okay, he's up on the rooftop. Now, he's in a Jewish home. They're preparing kosher food, right, while it's being prepared. I mean, what you ate, how you ate it, how you prepared it, that was so important. So he goes into this trance, and he has this vision of this sheet being let down, all kinds of four-footed creatures, and I'm sure Peter's going, "Oh, good, thanks, Lord. I'm so hungry. Those creatures look really good." And then the very next thing he sees is what? Reptiles. Whoa, wait a minute here. Well, I can't eat a reptile. That's forbidden in the law. Reptiles, birds of the air. Then he heard a voice saying, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." Peter says, "By no means." This is this phrase that Paul uses in Romans several times in Greek, meganoita. No way. Impossible. What's that Princess Bride thing? Oh, inconceivable, yeah. That's basically what this means. It's like, inconceivable. Can't do it, right? I have never eaten anything that is profane or unclean. And to tell you how ingrained that is, even in Peter, who's been with Jesus for 3 years, right? He has to have a vision of this 3 times. It's like the first time, no, sorry, not eating it. And God has to say, okay, show him the vision again. Nope, not doing it. Sorry. All right, replay. And so finally he gets it. And he goes into Cornelius' house and he eats with them. Okay, to just go through the door of a Gentile house would make you unclean. But to sit at a table and eat with them, okay. This is why later, I put the later there, what happens? The circumcised believers, and they mean, of course, believers in Jesus, right, criticized Peter saying, "Why did you go to the uncircumcised men and eat with them?" So this ramps up. We'll have to finish some of this next week, but I'll have to review this anyway. You move up to Acts 15, you have the Jerusalem Council, where they're debating now, okay, a lot of Gentiles coming into the church. What are we going to do, right? We have our traditions, and what are we going to expect them to do? They finally decide, okay, we don't need to have them circumcised, but we do want them to be sensitive to 4 issues. Tobin, go ahead and put up that chart. Okay, so they get together and they decide, okay, if we're going to have Jews and Gentiles meeting together to worship, and of course now remember, Paul is not talking here about just private matters. He's not talking about matters between you and God in your own home, right? He's talking about matters because the church is eating meals together, right? They have the agape feast. The church is having communion together, right? And so what James and Peter and the elders of the Jerusalem church say is, okay, there's 4 areas we want you guys, you Gentiles, we're going to send this letter out to all the Gentile churches, and we want you to be really sensitive to your brothers and sisters, the Jews, on these areas. Avoid meat sacrificed to idols. And it's interesting because all 4 of these, where do they get the precedent for this? From the Torah, from Leviticus. They go back to their Bibles and they go, okay, what does it say about Gentiles living amongst us, right? And we're going to kind of lay that out here. Any foreigner who resides among you, offers a sacrifice outside the tabernacle to the Lord, shall be cut off from the people, right? So don't want to eat meat sacrificed to idols. 2, avoid blood, right? So I talked about how you prepare the meat, how you kill it, how you drain the blood. Really, can you Gentiles just be really sensitive about this, right? When you're having meals together, like, you don't want a little pool of blood in the plate, Same thing. Any foreigner who resides among you, eats any blood, will be cut off from the people, for the life of the flesh is in the blood. Avoid meat that is strangled, right? So that's another preparation issue. A Jewish butcher is not going to strangle an animal, okay? Matter of fact, in Judaism, you cannot shock an animal to prepare them. You can't stun them like they do in a lot of meat packing places today, right? That's not kosher. You have to, you can't even saw, you're just going to, avoid meat that has been strangled. Abstain from fornication, okay? Well, sacrifice to idols and fornication, those were kind of the 2 things that were really associated with Gentiles there. So, finally, real quickly, the ongoing issue of table fellowship in Antioch. So there's a story in Acts and in Galatians where Paul and Antioch's kind of like the cutting edge church of Jews and Gentiles coming together, okay? And so they're eating meals together, and Peter comes up from Jerusalem, and he sits at the table with the Gentiles, and he eats with the Gentiles. And then all of a sudden, there's a group of, elders that comes from the Jerusalem church, and they walk in the door, and they see Peter and Barnabas eating with Gentiles, eating their food, right? And Peter and Barnabas go, uh-oh, this is a problem. And they basically say, well, we can't do this anymore. We can't eat with you Gentiles. And Paul has a fit. When Cephas, Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood self-condemned. For until certain people came from James in Jerusalem, he used to eat with the Gentiles, but after they came, he drew back, kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. And the other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led astray. You see how strong this pull is, how strong this tradition is. That even, these top pillars of apostles, and Barnabas, son of encouragement, who's been with Paul on his mission, right? It's just troubling to them to do this. And so I want us to really understand, because this is kind of the background to what Paul is going to talk about in the chapter as we kind of unpack it. And I don't often give you homework, but I would like you to read through this section, chapter 14, maybe this week. And also, if you can, read 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10, because they kind of work together. And that'll help kind of prepare us for the application stage as we talk about this and talk about how this has a lot of relevance, really, for the way we work with each other and worship with each other and respond to each other in the midst of challenges in our time. All right, let's pray. Thank you, Lord, for this time. We pray that you would open up our hearts to understand the encouragement and the attitudes that we need to have in order to accept our brothers, to welcome them, brothers and sisters who may feel differently about many issues in our church. Thank you for this challenging word to us in Jesus' name. Amen.